Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at the Codex Alera series by Jim Butcher, and we are thinking about whether or not you should be reading it. I'm going to give you some positives and some negatives on this series, and I'm going to give you my overall thoughts, whether it's something I think it is worth reading and picking up at the moment. So let's jump straight in. Codex Alera is a 6-book epic fantasy series by Jim Butcher, well known for the Dresden Files, among other things. Unsurprisingly, the main culture we follow in Codex Alera are the Alerans, and they are a bunch of Roman-esque people with a very Roman aesthetic and feel. They work on legions and on steadholts. It's very Roman feeling and very Roman Empire feeling. As well as that, we have a very mystical and magical world. The Alerans themselves have access to a magic known as Furycraft, so they can use different elements of the earth around them to almost manifest these elements into creatures that they can use for different things. So you have sort of fire furies, wood furies, earth furies, water furies, air furies are the main ones that we see come about in this series. The first book is called Furies of Calderon, and in this book we are following our main characters who we follow throughout the series, those being Tavi, who is a young man growing up on a steadholt. He has no access to this magic that I was talking about, no access to these furies. He cannot manifest furies, he cannot use them, and this makes him a bit of a freak. Every other Alerian has some access to fury crafting. They may only have small amounts of power, they may only be able to do one type of it, but every Alerian has access to some. Tavi is an exception to this, and we spend our time trying to work out why and seeing how Tavi manages in a world where everyone has this ability but he does not. This is an interesting setup. It is very much the standard farm boy trope, but we do get to see him not just suddenly realize he has power, we actually see him work with his limitations, and that's something I really appreciate with this series. I love watching Tavi struggle with his Furycraft or lack of Furycraft and how that puts him on the outskirts and on the outside in so many different situations. Tavi is an orphan and he lives with his auntie and uncle. So his uncle Bernard is the steadholder. He runs the steadholt of Bernard Holt along with his sister Asana. Now Asana is Tavi's aunt and we follow her as well. She's a powerful watercrafter. Bernard is a powerful earth crafter. He also has some woodcraft, I believe, as well. And they're our main 3 characters that we follow in Bernard Holt. We do follow other characters as well, mainly there Amara, who is a cursor, so she is a messenger and actually a spy, basically. She works in intelligence for the First Lord of the Realm, that's Gaius Sextus, who is an older man. He has no heir currently, and that plays a large part in the political wranglings of Codex Alera. As well as Amara, we have Fidelius, who is her mentor, who is also a cursor, but we discover very early on, in fact, I think it's the very first scene in Furies of Calderon, that Fidelius has stopped working for Gaius Sextus and is working with a set of rebels. So those are the 5 characters we start following in Furies of Calderon. They are really the 5 main characters that we follow, although we do see others come and go. Sometimes some of these are more prevalent than other times. Jim Butcher does a really good job keeping us interested with all of those characters and others, even when stuff isn't happening massively importantly for them and other characters are taking the lead in the series. So with that down as our starting point in the series, let's talk about some pros and some cons. So firstly, I'm going to preface this by saying that I really loved my time with Codex Alera. I absolutely adored it. I think Jim Butcher's writing style is brilliant and it's something I really love. One of the big positives for me here is that although there is a great overarching story, each of these books does stand fairly well on its own. Now, I don't mean by that you could read these out of order or you could just pick up a middle one, but what I'm saying is that you don't have to keep reading back to back to know what's going on. They do have contained climaxes and conclusions where you get some resolution and then you move on to the next book. And I think that's something that Jim Butcher does very well. It's something that we've seen with the Dresden Files, which feels even more episodic, but it's that kind of feel where there's not this big overarching story, long running, with no breaks, no conclusions, no little climaxes to sort of take breaks with. Here there is that great overarching story, but there is always a satisfying and a solid conclusion when we come to the end of a book. As well as that, another big positive is I love the character work throughout this series. We really grow to know our characters, we really grow to understand them, to get a real feel for who they are and what's going on. And not only do we understand them, but they start to understand themselves more often. And I love that. I love that they are changing and progressing. Sometimes that's just because they're growing up. Sometimes that's because they're growing up and being put in different dangerous and difficult situations, and that's great. And sometimes we are just seeing characters develop because they are starting to be more truthful to themselves. They're starting to understand themselves better, and actually that informs the way they act and the way they live. And I love that. I think that's amazing. Some of the characters in particular, I think Asana does this, where she really knows herself better and better as we go through. She stops lying to herself and she starts to really get to grips with what she is like and what is going on in the world around her and how she needs to engage with that. And I love that so much. I think that's such a good arc for her. And we see that with all the characters. We see really good arcs. Now, the third thing I want to talk about, this could be a positive or a negative for you. So the first thing I'm going to say as a negative is you might find the world building here a little bit kitschy, a little bit over the top in terms of like quite simplistic in terms of the ideas that I'm going to tell you it's involving. So this makes sense in some ways. So Jim Butcher was having an argument with people online before he wrote this, and he told someone online to give him the two most disparate ideas, two ideas that are rubbish and shouldn't work together, and if you write those well, you will make a good book. And this was the argument. Jim Butcher was arguing that good writing can make things work, and someone was arguing if the setup, if the idea is too out there, is too boring, is too old hat, been rehashed too many times, then it will not work, no matter how well you write it. Jim Butcher took up this challenge. He said, give me these two disparate ideas, two things that don't work together. And the guy said Pokemon and the Lost Roman Legion. And thus Codex Alera was born. We have Jim Butcher's take on a Pokemon-style magic system crossed with the Lost Roman Legion. Now, those two ideas, if you just say them like that, that does not sound like it's going to make a good fantasy world. Yet, it really does. And this is actually a positive for me. The world building of the Codex Alera series is just really good. And that's partially the way that Jim Butcher writes the magic system. It's partially the whole Lost Roman Legion thing. I do like that. I think it's done really well. And I can see how it could be really kitschy and horrible if you wrote it poorly, but it's not written poorly. I think as well as that, Jim Butcher's really roped in other things. I love the way he's brought in these barbarian tribes to sort of play off of the Alerans. We see that in book 1 a little bit, we see that in I think book 5 a lot more as well. I just really like the way he brings those in to be a contrast. As well as that, I love the other magical creatures. So the Vord are a set of creatures we see later on. I love this kind of hive mind intelligence that we get through the Vord, and I really love the Carnim. They are a wolf man sort of set of warriors, and as we discover more and more of them throughout the series, we see more and more of their culture. They go from sort of this big scary baddie in the first books to actually a really well fleshed out society and culture, and I think that's just really well done. I love the way that Jim Butcher approaches that, and I love Tavi and his interactions with Carnim throughout the entire series. I think it's just done so well. So here normally I'd love to give you a bunch more negatives to balance out some of those positives I've just said. Apart from the possible kitschy world building, I have no real massive negatives for the series. I can't give you many. This was a 5-star series for me. It was 6 5-star books. I give every single book in the Codex Alera series 5 stars. If you liked Jim Butcher's writing, if you enjoyed the Dresden Files, I would highly recommend Codex Alera as a high fantasy Jim Butcher work. And now I want to talk about this in terms of how it relates to other series you might have read. And what really struck me reading Codex Alera, and this is going to sound really weird, so bear with me, it feels like Wheel of Time light. And I'm saying that in a good way. I think that's a positive. Now, bear with me. Wheel of Time is amazing in the character arcs that it develops. I love the way it builds characters over a few years, and these characters grow and change so substantially. The character arcs are slow and plodding because there's so many books. But if you look at where characters were in book 1 and where they get to in book 14, it's incredible. The character arcs are absolutely awesome. As well as that, we have this very strong idea of cultures working better together, of having to cross political divides to bring different cultures together in different societies and different people groups together to do what is needed and do what is necessary. And as well as that, we have the classic, children from a farming setting out in the sticks who are exploded onto the main stage of the world and have to deal with being big, well-known people in massive cities and countries, and they've started from such a small, humble beginnings. Now, all of these things are super present in Codex Alera as well. We get that humble beginnings to well-known running things kind of setup that we have in the Wheel of Time. We have that bringing societies and cultures and nations together to achieve something greater. We have that kind of idea of getting past the political differences and working to unite people on what they can agree on. And I love that as well. And then we also have a bunch of brilliant character arcs. Now, this is only over 6 books instead of 14, but in some ways that for me is a strength. I would argue that Codex Alera for the general average reader is going to hold attention much better than, say, the middle books of Wheel of Time, which is being well talked about as the slog. But I would say that Codex Alera doesn't have a slog because it's much shorter. Things are keep moving more and more, faster paced. Things are always occurring and changing and happening. But that does mean that the build isn't quite as epic because we don't have as much time to have that epic build, if you see what I'm saying. So if you like the idea of the Wheel of Time and how people talk about the Wheel of Time, yet you've started it and it feels too slow and too glacial and it's too difficult and boring, there's too many characters, but you want that kind of feeling, I would highly, highly recommend Codex Alera by Jim Butcher. And I know that's a weird way to sell it, but I absolutely loved it. And I do think you should be reading Codex Alera if you are an epic fantasy, high fantasy fan. I hope you found that interesting. Do let me know down below your thoughts on Codex Alera if you've read it. If you haven't, do you think you want to pick it up or not? Let me know. And if you want to see any more of my content, there should be another one of my videos over here now. And I will see you guys again soon.